Well, I think that's right. You don't get appointed to these jobs, of course, unless you're willing to be a bad guy, whether you're the Supreme Court or cabinet officers, heads of the Fed, heads of all the federal regulatory departments. They're not appointing, let's put it this way, the Elio Beltraus of the North are not appointed to those jobs. So that's just the way it is. And but I think the incentives, the incentives are all wrong if, from our standpoint, the people who are ruled for the rulers, if, again, they have power lust. So yeah, it's not, that's how they can gain more power over people, by going into the government, by becoming Fed chairman, by doing all these terrible things, by bailing out the banks and Wall Street and creating this vast business cycle and all that. But I think it's, so yeah, the incentives are wrong, from our standpoint, but they're not wrong from their standpoint. Robert Higgs, the wonderful Robert Higgs, had an article talking, and he was talking about the state schools in the U.S., the public secondary schools, and saying that everyone always says that they failed. And he said if you look at literacy rates, if you look at just in general what children are learning, the crushing of independent thought, independent minds, this sort of stupido classes that are taught, the exams that are given, everything getting stupider and stupider year by year. He says, from the parent standpoint, from the student standpoint, that's a failure, but that's not a failure from the state's standpoint. It's exactly what the state wants. They want an easily controlled population. And they set out to. So I don't think you can, disagree with some of our speakers yesterday, but I don't think you can think of the state as a firm. Because, of course, if a firm is sending guys out with guns to grab your money, it's not a business, right? It's a criminal gang. And as Rothbard always talked about the state as a criminal gang writ large. He said you will understand virtually all of what libertarians believe if you think of the government as a gang of thieves. Then everything follows from that. So the incentives for a gang of thieves are different than for the people who are the producers and live peaceful lives and are productive economically and raise nice families and go to church and live their lives well. So I don't know if it's, the incentives are wrong, but whether you can ever have good incentives in the state, I don't know. I'll just mention Ron Paul once introduced a bill, obviously having fun with it, to pay the members of Congress a huge amount of money as a percentage of what they would cut from the federal budget. So let's say they cut $100 billion from the federal budget, they'd all be rich. And they could be even richer if they cut $1 trillion or whatever. So that was, it is possible to conceive of setting up the right incentives, but difficult to see such a thing implemented.
Lew, durante o seminário, nós tivemos uma palestra sobre homeschooling do Kleber Nunes, que corajosamente declarou que não vai cumprir a determinação do Estado por considerar essa determinação imoral. O que você acha da desobediência civil?
Well, first of all, I think what a tremendous hero he is. And it's one of the great things I think about the U.S. We have so many millions of children being homeschooled. It's a great act of secession from the regime. There was just a German family that got political asylum in the U.S. Because they were about to be jailed in Germany for the crime of homeschooling. So it's not only a crime in Brazil, but in Germany and other countries. I believe in civil disobedience. On the other hand, I would very much hesitate to urge civil disobedience on anyone because I think it's such an individual decision. Because, of course, if one is not pro-violence, and I think one ought not to be pro-violence, then you're going to have, you may very well have terrible consequences. So I think that has to be an individual decision. But I think civil disobedience is moral, and I tend to think that sort of a mass peaceful resistance to the regime is the way that we'll actually bring some things about in the future. So I certainly hope that he doesn't have to suffer the results of civil disobedience. I hope he can continue to raise his children and continue to be an example to everybody who knows him. He's a great man.
sua opinião sobre o modelo de Hayek de free banking, que seria a reserva fracionária sem lastro determinado?
Well, I like start at a little different place. I think Hayek's view of competitive currencies is right now a very interesting one, probably much more likely of success than the gold standard. The gold standard, unfortunately, requires good guys in the government, or at least people who feel it's in their interest to bring about honest money. I know Ron Paul is finding that it's a much easier argument to make that people think that, well, maybe there is something wrong with a monopoly. Why shouldn't American Express or somebody else be able to issue their own currency as long as it's a voluntary thing? Since I'm an anarcho-capitalist, I certainly don't believe in laws against free banking in the sense of government laws. On the other hand, I don't think, I'm just quoting Salerno and Rothbard and Thornton and Woods, I don't think that fractional reserves are good thing because they're capable of creating the business cycle, among other questions. Hoppe makes the point that it's the equivalent of a used car dealer issuing more titles to cars than he owns, and he goes, and offers them as security to people. So even if people know he's doing that, Hans feels there's something funny about it. And of course, this is the juridical argument against fractional reserve banking is at the heart of Jesus Huerta de Soto's huge and magnificent treatise on money and banking and business cycles, which I highly recommend. And I think a Portuguese translation is underway of that book. So that would it's because it's huge. It's going to take a while, but so I don't think it's good. But on the other hand, if you and a banker want to make an agreement to that event, I don't think it should be illegal, but I think it can have bad effects. Rothbard thought that the way to try to hold these bad effects to a minimum was to encourage private bank run squads. People would sort of watch out for who the banks that were really getting out of hand in terms of fractional reserves and warn the customers, hey, all your money is not in there, you better get it out. This, by the way, is a felony in the U.S. if you do this. Because you can't libel a bank. You can't, in fact, tell the truth about the bank, that indeed the money's not there, it's all been loaned out, and they've just got a small fraction. But it's a very tough problem, but I'm not for outlawing a private free banking contract. But just as in the days before central banks, it's possible for fractional reserve banks to bring on a business cycle. So it's not good.
Tem uma pergunta lá atrás?
Lew, uma pergunta um pouco mais polêmica. Democracia. Vale a pena insistir nesse erro ou devemos advogar a secessão imediata?
Well, I think first of all, I'd recommend everybody read Hans Hermann Hoppe's Democracy, the God That Failed. Very, very interesting book. And Hans holds that democracy has been the friendliest form of government to the state in the history of mankind, and it's not a coincidence that the biggest, most powerful, richest, most dangerous states, at least on a more than local level, are the democratic states, the somewhat liberal democratic states. That they're the ones that are really able to be the troublemakers. And he's got a great analysis of why democracies are so much worse than monarchies. He's an anarcho-capitalist, of course, Hoppe, but he thinks that monarchy is the least bad form of government. So I hope the monarchist movement in Brazil gets going. Anyway, because the king who wants to pass on the realm to his heirs always seeks to preserve the realm because he sees it in some sense as his private property. That under a democracy, the realm is public property. And the people who are temporary caretakers of public property rip it off. And he also traces the most fastest growth of the state in the U.S. with each time the franchise was expanded. And he thinks that, like, one person, one vote system is actually the worst possible thing. So, on the other hand, the trouble is, of course, the state uses these words, perverts these words, and, democratic can also mean sort of local self-government, or it can mean friendly ways of doing things, and non-totalitarian, and democracy as opposed to dictatorship and so forth. But he would argue, and I would certainly agree with him, that that's a false dichotomy. But no matter what form of government, I think secession is always an important thing to talk about. Mises said in Nation, State, and Economy that no people and no part of a people, as a principle of classical liberalism, that no people and no part of a people should be held in a political association that it does not want. And he even says that if such a thing were technologically possible, that's not the phrase he uses, that even individuals should be able to secede. Well, maybe it's technologically possible now, but you can tell the things that outrage the regime, and that you should be talking about some things like the secession. I mean, it threatens them. They're very afraid of it, because of course they want to consolidate. It's always a tendency towards consolidation within nation states and among nation states, and there's more and more of a drive for a world government, a world currency, world central bank, the sort of nightmare that Keynes wished upon us. So I think the actual facts of secession are very important. People ought to be able to secede from the EU rather than being kept in there against their will. People should be able to secede from the U.S. central state, from the Brazilian central state, from any central state, and all the former. The sort of Jeffersonian principle, Lord Acton called it the one great U.S. contribution to political theory of federalism and decentralism, that by divided sovereignty, by having powerful states as versus a central government, that overall the whole country would be freer, because each would prevent the other from getting out of hand, at least to some extent. Of course, it didn't work in the U.S., right? I mean, eventually they just killed everybody who had a different view. But to talk about it, and Walter Williams just had a wonderful column on secession. I always like to talk about peaceful secession. Professor Williams said peaceful secession or otherwise. So it's very hot, of course. I'm not actually for anything but peaceful secession. But I think it's very important to talk about it, to learn about it, and I think whether, in fact, we talked about, could you have freedom in a nation state as large and consolidated as Brazil or the United States, or the EU is becoming? Probably not. I mean, Aristotle thought that anything more than 50,000 was getting out of hand. So I don't know if we have to be that small, but certainly you can't be hundreds of millions ruled by one bunch in a distant government-created capital city, and have that be comport with liberty. I think that's so. The whole idea of secession, talk about secession. It's also not even the idea of breaking. Let's say some part of Sao Paulo wanted to break away and be its own city. That's again an important thing, and to be supported. And typically the other people will say, "Hey, you can't take that. We got to have your taxes." Well, in fact, the state of Sao Paulo, as I learned, fought for its freedom against the central government in the 1930s. It was tragically defeated, but fought for the old constitution and against being part of the nation state of Brazil. So this tradition goes across the world. As much as they try to suppress it, as much as they try to smear it, the regime and its media. Very important to think about it, write about it, talk about it. Hoppa's written a lot about it. Take a look at some of his articles and speeches. Just go to Mises.org and put secession into the search engine. You'll come up with a whole bunch of stuff. Very, very interesting. So I think it's great to secede, and if at first you don't secede, try again.